Welcome to the 5th Graphic Studio Gallery featured artist program interview. Today we are talking to Ria Czerniak-LeBov, who is a Dublin-based artist and musician. After Ria graduated from NCD in Fine Art and Visual Culture in 2016, she was awarded the Graduate Award at Graphic Studio Dublin and since then has been a full-time member. Ria, in your statement you suggest that your work represents an exploration of spatial memory. Do you depict places that you are familiar with in some way? What does the place have to be for you to choose it as a subject of your print?
I think all the places that I've etched are places I've been. Some of them more habitually, and others on a once-off occasion. But I definitely am revisiting places I've been, and some of them are more like portraits or love letters to places that I'm very familiar with. I have etchings of Ima and the National Gallery and the glass houses in the Botanic Gardens. And then there are others that are more like street scenes. And I'm literally re-walking journeys that I've made, whether it's been commuting or going to meet someone at a time that felt really significant. Yeah, they're definitely all pretty curated places.
Tell me, how does the actual image come about and where does the technology come in within your making process? I know that you used Google Maps to generate some of your imagery. In that sense, technology plays a conceptual and technical role in your work. Do you also use a digital software to manipulate the image in your process of creation? Tell me about the three different tensions you mentioned in relation to your work: found imagery and original imagery, the valuable and valueless, analog and digital.
I think I'd preface my answer by saying I'm really, really terrible with technology. I find it really overwhelming and a bit intimidating. And I think I was one of the few people when we were doing Photoshop in college who managed to kind of break it in a way that the tutor hadn't seen before. So the technology I'm using is very basic. I still use Microsoft Paint. I'm still a fan of Pritt stick and scissors and making collages, but the imagery itself is often sourced through apps or technology. I do use Google Street View a lot, and I remember the first time I saw, your phone can do a panorama, and there was something incredible for that about that to me, that it was like a cinematic kind of technique that you could take in a full 360 of where you were. And when you look really closely at them, they're kind of knitted together from a lot of still imagery. And I think because I don't fully understand technology, I'm really aware of all of the quirks of it and I'm really curious about how it's working. And I think when it came to the valuable and the valueless, it was the fact that when we all had good enough phones to take high quality photographs, they became really disposable and you could take thousands of photographs and just delete them and have the capacity to store that quantity of imagery. Whereas when we were younger and we had film cameras, you were a lot more careful about what you were photographing, and it was such a surprise getting them developed. And I think just how we absorb information in the digital era is inherently different. And I think that that has made, yeah, it's probably made imagery less valuable or precious in a lot of ways. And I think certainly like Google Street View is quite it's very utilitarian. We look at it for directions or if you're trying to find somewhere, and we don't really think about it in terms of being visually all that interesting. But I find it amazing, and it's a real snapshot of a very particular moment in time, and it always has the day that the Google van captured that place. And whether it was in spring or summer, or there were roadworks at the time, and maybe the shop names have changed, and building works have been completed and the place is almost unrecognizable. I think the imagery is updated every few years, and so I find myself making like inventories of screen grabs of places that I know really well as they're developing. And I think one of the things with analog and digital as well is that I don't think it gets much more physical than etching. And it's pretty old school technology. And I think to juxtapose that with the kind of technology I'm talking about now, with images being spliced together or pixelating because of your computer running slow, or I'm really into glitches. And then when you hand draw them or etch them into metal, I find that the juxtaposition of those two things is really interesting to me.
In some works, you place yourself figuratively into the composition. What is the reason for that?
I think that the composition of images changes an awful lot depending on whether there's a figure in it. Sometimes when you have a character in a scene, it feels almost voyeuristic, like you're spying on somebody or watching them do something. And other times where there's nobody there, it's like an invitation to the viewer to step in and for them to be the explorer. And that's definitely something I'd play with in terms of narration, or the implication that there's a story going on. And I think as a subject matter, you're always available to yourself. So often it does end up being me that I put into scenes. Although I think when you look closely at a lot of my etchings, there are characters, even if they're in silhouette, because I'm mostly doing urban scenes. They are inherently peopled. And there are other times that I want them to feel almost post-apocalyptic, and I'll remove all of the characters before I draw them.
Can you tell me how you arrived to the creation of composite prints and your monochrome aesthetics? What is the concept, and how would you describe the position of your work on the larger scheme of visual cultural landscape?
I think the era of art history that's most influenced me would definitely be modernism and black and white photography by Man Ray and films by Maya Deren and Agnes Varda. And I think my favourite era of film would be film noir. And I think the starkness of the shadows and the overall composition would be something that I reference a lot in my etchings. I think that one of the biggest markers of time in a composition or in a photograph or in an etching is the light. And I'm obsessed with shadows. And you can go back and photograph the same space so many times at different times of day or year, and they'll look completely transformed. And I also think that conceptually, my prints were trying to maybe incorporate some of the movement of cinema. So the tracking shots evolved out of mechanisms like fade outs and panning across scenes. And the two largest tracking shots, I call them, that were made up of smaller etchings, they were trying to get the viewer to slow down their absorption of the imagery, and instead of a camera, that they were panning across the image. And I think the titles of them were plays on frames per second and vignettes. And they also challenged the process of etching. I remember trying to see how many times I could ink up and put a piece of copper through a printing press without it fading away and without my lines and aquatints just getting weaker and weaker. And one of them I managed to get, I think, 252 prints from a plate before it started to degrade. And that's also really interesting, just formally, how far can you push print? And in a world where we're all influenced by so much visual culture, whether it's the ads we see or the films we watch, how does print still relate to all of the broader visual culture that we absorb all the time, whether consciously or unconsciously?
As Dr. Angela Griffith writes, in relation to your practice, and more specifically your print from the current Diamond Point exhibition titled Paragon, you have an appreciation for the quality of a well-made print, but at the same time see printmaking as a way of experimentation, spontaneity, and exploration. What does it mean to you to be respectable of the process of printmaking, and how does the quality of traditionally made print connect with the experimental element of your practice?
I'd say I could divide my practice into how and why I make work. And the how I make work is probably not, it's not reinventing the wheel. It definitely adheres to the traditional conventions of making prints. And I have a massive respect for skill, and I absolutely love the medium of print. And I definitely still file my edges and wipe my plates in a way that has been done for a very long time. I think conceptually, or how I source imagery, would be pushing the boundaries maybe a little bit more, but I do love the process. And I love being surrounded by so many skilled people at Graphic Studio and seeing their work come out of the printing press and knowing that it's probably been done in a similar way for years and years by so many skilled printmakers. And I feel kind of conscious that I'm carrying on traditional printmaking, but also trying to keep it relevant and interesting even for myself and hopefully for the people looking at it.
One of the most impressive works of yours, to me personally, is the tracking device 1.0 to 10.8. Can you tell me about it? From the concept to the technicality of the making process. Is it the largest work you have made, and how do you decide on the size? And how does this change of the scale affect your work?
I had made really large scale tracking shots of etchings before, and I think in a way the tracking shot, the one you're talking about, was the culmination of loads of trial and error and what I call prototypes. I can prototype forever, and sometimes those things end up in exhibitions. But I think the previous ones that I had done were really formally interesting to me, but it was like I hadn't quite worked out the imagery that would match the mechanism. And then I was standing in a train station in Berlin in the Hauptbahnhof, and it became incredibly obvious to me that if I was talking about the cinematic mechanism of a tracking device, and they are almost on train tracks, like to film really smooth transitions along a scene. And I was standing there realizing, I guess it was a visual play on words, but from a very personal point of view, I think I felt quite unnerved being in Berlin, and especially train stations, because my grandfather escaped the Holocaust. Our family are Jewish, and like most families, they would have had relatives who escaped the war, and he came from Poland. And just the transportation of Jews on trains around that part of Europe, I felt kind of uneasy. And the view from that train station was the Reichstag, and where a lot of decisions would have been made, and we were standing in no man's land, or what had been. And I just really wanted to capture the revisitation of trauma. I remember reading a paper by Freud, and he had a whole concept of the compulsion to repeat, and it was how we keep going back to incidences to kind of make sense of them or to get over them. And I wanted to keep repeating that scene until I understood why I felt uncomfortable with it. And I think the scale helped with that, like the largeness of that entire European era of history. That I think I made that piece for a graphic studio exhibition called The New State, and a lot of people's work, I'm sure, related maybe to the state of Ireland, but my piece was definitely about the right to create a new state in the wake of national trauma, or wanting to overcome shameful histories and start anew, and where it fits in. I was standing in this beautiful modern train station, but you couldn't really get away from the position in history that that place occupied.
In terms of thinking about the future, in what direction do you see your work going? Is there anything in particular that you would like to explore?
I think my work has been on a steady kind of progression over the last few years. It might seem it's definitely stayed pretty architecturally themed visually, but I think it's slowly moving in different directions. And I know that that'll evolve as different kind of areas of concern pop up. I don't know what way technology is going to evolve, or certainly, like, we didn't see a pandemic coming, and how we communicate with each other has changed. And even the constraints, I found myself drawing an awful lot more areas that are very close to me physically during the lockdowns this year. And a lot of my work would have been influenced also by travel, which has been completely rendered obsolete. I know that it's going to change just due to practicalities, but I also hope, like harking back to the tracking shots, when I was in college, I don't think I really thought about the practicalities of framing or gallery spaces. I just made pretty enormous impractical things, and I would like to do more installations without any concern about how the things would be stored or produced, and just dive right into them again. So I know that I'll continue making etchings in the same vein as I do, but I would like to just keep stretching them in any which direction.
Mhm.